This is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which hopefully will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. In Tennessee, on April 12, 1864, a Confederate military installation named after Tennessee native General Gideon Johnson Pillow, which was taken by Union forces in 1862, was the site of the most gruesome, controversial, and little-known massacres of the Civil War. During the Battle of Fort Pillow, Confederate troops killed nearly 400 black Union soldiers, and this was after they had surrendered, because the Confederacy refused to treat black soldiers as traditional prisoners of war. This massacre would become a rallying point for those enslaved and fighting for their freedom. Eventually, black Union soldiers would use "Remember Fort Pillow" as their battle cry. "40 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, on the Mississippi River stood Fort Pillow. Though well protected on a high bluff, Confederate troops evacuated the fort in order to avoid being cut off from the rest of the Confederate Army on June 4, 1862. 2 days later, Union forces occupied Fort Pillow, using it to protect their approach to Memphis. By the end of 1862, the number of white volunteers in the Union Army was on a steady decline, while the number of escaped slaves, or as they were classified by the Union Army, contraband, was on the increase. Wrestling with the idea of authorizing the recruitment of black troops, President Abraham Lincoln was concerned that such a move would prompt the border states to secede. The deployment of black men as U.S. soldiers, combined with Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, profoundly pissed off the Confederates. They called it, quote, uncivilized, end quote, which is kind of ironic when it was the Confederacy who fought to keep human beings in bondage. That's not very civilized when you stop to think about it. In May of 1863, the Confederacy responded by passing a law stating that all black U.S. soldiers, quote, captured while fighting against the Confederacy would be turned over to the state where the captured would be tried according to state laws, end quote. Simply put, they would be executed. The Union garrison at the newly acquired Fort Pillow consisted of close to 600 men, divided almost evenly between black and white troops. The black soldiers belonged to the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery and a section of the 2nd Colored Light Artillery, previously known as the Memphis Battery Light Artillery. They were all under the command of Major Lionel F. Booth. His real name was George H. Lanning. He took the alias of Lionel F. Booth to protect his family from Confederate assassins who were trying to find them. Apparently, this practice was common among a number of Union officers. On April 12, 1864, at 10 a.m., General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would later serve as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in the early years of Reconstruction, led the raid to take back Fort Pillow. 1,500 to 2,500 Confederate cavalrymen surrounded the fort. For the Union soldiers, the poorly constructed fortifications made the defense of Fort Pillow difficult. Confederate sharpshooters kept up constant fire throughout the day. Major Lionel F. Booth was killed by a sniper's bullet. His inexperienced second officer, Major William Bradford, assumed command. By 3:30 p.m., Forrest sent a note demanding the Union soldiers' unconditional surrender. Major Bradford refused to surrender, and Forrest then ordered his bugler to sound the charge. The Confederates came in like a furious tidal wave. Forrest's men massacred most of the Union soldiers in cold blood. Surviving members of the garrison said that most of their men surrendered and threw down their arms, only to be shot or bayoneted by the attackers, who repeatedly shouted, "No quarter, no quarter."
This is African American History is American History.
One of Forrest's own sergeants, Achilles V. Clark, wrote a letter to his sisters, both of whom were married to slave-holding Confederate soldiers, on April 14th, 1864, and he described the experience.
My dear sisters, I write you in a few hurried lines to inform you that I am quite well and have just passed safely through the most terrible ordeal of my whole life. I guess that you know what I mean, as you doubtless have before this heard of the taking of Fort Pillow. Inasmuch as I am a member of Forrest's cavalry, modesty would direct that I should say nothing in our praise, nor will I, but will tell you in as few words as possible what was done, and leave you to judge whether or not we acted well or ill. About 7 a.m. Tuesday, we marched on foot in sight of the fortifications, which were said to be manned by about 700 renegade Tennesseans and Negroes, commanded by Major Booth of the Negro Regiment and Major Bradford of the 13th Tennessee. The fort is quite small, just about large enough to hold 1,000 men in 2 ranks. The ditch is 8 feet deep and 6 wide, and the dirt thrown from the ditch on the inside formed a bank 5 feet high, making from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the breastwork 13 feet, up which we had to climb. By 2:00 p.m., General Forrest demanded a surrender and gave 20 minutes to consider. The Yankees refused, threatening that if we charged their breastworks, to show no quarter. The bugle sounded the charge, and in less than 10 minutes we were in the fort, hurling the cowardly villains howling down the bluff. The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor, deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands, scream for mercy. But they were ordered to their feet, and then shot down. The white men fared but little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Blood, human blood, stood about in pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded. But General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of the blood, and the firing ceased.
Confederate casualties were comparatively low, 14 killed and 86 wounded. On April 24th, 1864, the New York Times reported, quote, "Out of 400 Negro soldiers, only about 20 survived," end quote. The remains of those killed were moved to Memphis National Cemetery in 1867. 109 of the graves have been identified. For decades afterward, it was denied by the South that this massacre even took place. Eventually, it had become one of many horrific Civil War battles forgotten by time. But in 2005, historian Andrew Ward reached the conclusion that an atrocity in the modern sense did in fact occur at Fort Pillow. But, quote, the event was not premeditated nor officially sanctioned by Confederate commanders, end quote. In 1974, Fort Pillow was preserved as the Fort Pillow State Historic Park and was designated a National Historic Landmark. The signs at the Fort Pillow site barely refer to the many black soldiers who were slaughtered. It wasn't until April 12, 2017, that a wreath-laying ceremony with color guard and 21-gun salute was held at the cemetery to commemorate them.
This has been African American History is American History. The episode you've been listening to, Remember Fort Pillow, was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. The voice actor for this episode was Jeffrey Schubert as Sergeant Achilles V. Clark. I'm Harlan Kearsley, and on behalf of everyone here at African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please hit the subscribe button. Once you do, you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are posted. Thanks again, and please stay safe. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2020.